Welcome back to the deep dive. Grab your coffee, maybe, because today we are synthesizing a truly colossal stack of information.
Yeah, this is a big one.
We're cutting through the U.S. political brinkmanship. We're dissecting real-time movements in the U.K. property market, like right down to the square foot, translating some pretty opaque macroeconomic signals, and then really culminating in the high-stakes analysis of the Bank of England's, well, razor-thin rate decision and all the accelerating budget drama here in the UK.
It is a massive undertaking, absolutely. And globally connected in ways that just make policy incredibly challenging right now,
Yeah.
We need to move pretty seamlessly from, say, a $38 trillion debt discussion happening in Washington
Right.
to the average price reduction on a semi-detached house somewhere in Manchester, all while trying to track how central banks are fighting this really quite structural inflation.
So our mission, as always, is to extract the key nuggets from all this source material, giving you, our listener, a comprehensive, well-informed view of the economic forces shaping decision-making right now.
Yeah, we want you to walk away understanding not just the facts, but maybe the structural pressures behind them, what's really driving things.
Exactly. And we thought we'd frame this entire deep dive around a core tension, really. Something that's defined post-financial crisis policy.
Right, and it's probably best captured by that David Cameron quote from back in 2013. Still feels very relevant today.
Which one was that again?
The one where he said, "It is hard to overstate the fundamental importance of low interest rates for an economy as indebted as ours." And then he linked it, saying, "By sticking to our deficit reduction plans, we can keep interest rates low."
Ah, yes. That's the blueprint, isn't it? It links the two massive policy levers: fiscal choice, what the government does, and the monetary outcome, what the bank has to do.
Precisely. What the government chooses to spend, or maybe tax, directly influences what the Bank of England has to do with interest rates. If the government is fiscally loose, well, the bank has to tighten the screws monetarily.
To stop debt spirals, stop inflation getting out of control.
Exactly. So every spending decision, every little tax tweak you hear about in the upcoming budget speculation, it's fundamentally a defense mechanism against higher interest rates.
Right.
The government needs to signal to the markets that it's taking the inflation threat seriously. Why? So the cost of servicing that enormous national debt stays, well, manageable.
It's the tightrope walk, isn't it, of the modern economy?
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start across the pond with what we're calling Trump Watch. The story dominating headlines for weeks now has been the government shutdown. It feels like, I don't know, normalized chaos over there.
That normalization is the really chilling part, isn't it? This particular drama has now surpassed its previous record length. That alone should be a huge flashing red light about institutional failure.
Yeah.
When the government effectively just stops functioning properly, the economic consequences are immediate, even if they're sometimes hidden until a bit later.
So give us a sense of those immediate impacts beyond, the obvious stuff like federal workers not getting paid.
Well, the first major casualty that we could really track was consumer confidence. It started slipping noticeably, almost straight away.
Why so fast?
Because uncertainty becomes the governing emotion, right? People start delaying big purchases, they worry about their jobs, they fear the ripple effects, even if they're not directly affected.
Okay.
And the polling seems to back this up. It suggests most Americans aren't really struggling to assign blame here. They're pointing the finger pretty squarely at the man in charge for this whole procedural logjam.
It's hard to spin a narrative of economic strength when core government services are just deliberately paused, I suppose.
Precisely. And the political conflict didn't just stop at the bureaucratic level, did it? It escalated quite rapidly, targeting the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP payments, food stamps.
Yeah, that felt like a hugely aggressive political move.
It was a brutal piece of political theater, frankly. Initially, the administration just declared they would withhold those SNAP payments.
And the scale here is massive, right?
Huge. To grasp the severity, we're talking about 42 million low-income Americans. That's like 1 in 8 people in the U.S. who rely on these benefits literally to eat. So using food security as leverage in a budget fight, that's pretty extreme stuff.
And then it all got tangled up in the courts, didn't it? A real procedural whirlwind.
It did, yeah, involving every level of the judiciary. It's quite a fascinating bit of detail, actually. A district court, seeing the immediate harm, mandated that the payments must be made.
Okay, so the court stepped in.
Right. But the administration fought back immediately. They appealed to the First Circuit Court, and this is unusually rapid, they basically leapfrogged that process and went straight to the Supreme Court.
Asking for what?
seeking an administrative stay, basically asking the Supreme Court to pause the lower court's order. And the Supreme Court granted a temporary freeze, just a 48-hour temporary halt.
Wow. So how did that 48-hour window play out across the states in real time? Must have been chaos.
Absolute chaos is right. Certain states, having already got the initial lower court order, literally rushed to process the payments, millions and millions of dollars on the Friday.
Before the freeze kicked in.
Exactly. Before the Supreme Court's 48-hour freeze could fully block their ability to act. The situation was literally a race against the clock. You had state governments trying to protect their most vulnerable citizens, while the federal government was actively trying to stop them.
It just underlines the savage nature of using core welfare provision as a political tool in that kind of standoff.
It really does.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the bigger macro picture in the U.S. You hear the term Trump slump thrown around, but when you actually look at the raw numbers, the U.S. economy seems, okay, fine even.
It's a real study in contradictions, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is why you see economists so polarized. On the surface, yeah, the short-term metrics look acceptable. Growth is pretty robust.
Right.
Unemployment is ticking up a bit, but it remains low overall, certainly better than here in the UK. And critically, the stock market hit new highs recently.
So where's the problem? Inflation, maybe.
Inflation is hovering around 3%, which is definitely the high end of acceptable for the Fed. And tariffs are undoubtedly contributing to those sticky prices, making imports more expensive.
Yeah.
So the average consumer may be looking at their 401k, their pension pot, and their ability to find a job might actually feel okay.
But you mentioned earlier the warning is structural, and that revolves entirely around debt, doesn't it? Which looks truly alarming in its scale and speed.
Alarm is possibly an understatement here. The national debt surpassed $38 trillion back in October.
$38 trillion.
Yeah. And let's just pause there for a second. We only crossed $37 trillion in August.
Wow.
That means the U.S. debt grew by $1 trillion in just 71 days. That speed is, well, it's terrifying.
That velocity of debt accumulation, and what does it fundamentally tell us about U.S. fiscal discipline right now?
It tells us there's basically zero fiscal discipline. And crucially, there's no justification being offered for it.
What do you mean?
Well, in previous periods where we saw debt grow really rapidly, think back to the global financial crisis or the peak of the pandemic, there was a clear emergency rationale given. Right now, there's no crisis cited, no declared emergency, no big buzzword being used to justify these gigantic, persistent federal spends and deficits. It's just happening.
So the structural damage isn't necessarily the current growth rate hurting things today, but it's the elimination of future fiscal flexibility. Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. When you rack up debt this quickly during a period of relative calm, you completely wipe out your ability to respond effectively to a genuine future shock, deep recession, a war, another pandemic.
Right.
You also make yourself increasingly reliant on foreign buyers for your U.S. treasuries. And just think about the interest payments required to service $38 trillion. They're astronomical. They consume an ever larger slice of the federal budget that could otherwise be spent on, say, infrastructure or education or healthcare.
So it's structural weakness dressed up in short-term acceptable growth figures.
Perfectly put. That's the danger.
And finally, on the U.S., let's quickly touch on foreign policy. The administration seems to be redefining what constitutes armed conflict. What's happening there?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a clear escalation against drug cartels, particularly in the fight against fentanyl. The administration has openly reported using missile strikes on vessels in the Eastern Pacific and also in the Caribbean.
Missile strikes.
Yes. And crucially, the language they're using is that they are actively involved in armed conflict with these groups. Now, that's a dramatic escalation in both rhetoric and action.
And the process for authorizing this, it seems to be secondary, even though Congress tried to reclaim some power there.
It does seem secondary, which is the institutional problem, really. While the administration is prosecuting this, Congress, specifically the Senate, recently defeated an attempt to require the president to seek explicit congressional authorization before carrying out these strikes.
So the executive branch is just pushing ahead.
It continues this trend of blurring the lines between foreign military action and domestic law enforcement. It allows military action to proceed effectively unchecked by the legislature. It's a very significant shift, potentially, in the balance of power and even how we define a conflict zone. #, 10 of 2. The real-time UK property market score, data from week 43.
Okay, moving back to the UK then, let's dive deep into the granular reality of the property market here. We've got the data from week 43, And the narrative, well, it continues to be one of inventory overload and necessary pricing shifts, doesn't it?
Yeah, the market is certainly cooling down as we approach the year end, which is normal seasonally, but maybe more pronounced this year. Week 43 listings came in at 27,500.
Which is?
It's a noticeable seasonal drop, yeah. And it's sitting below the 9-year average for that specific week, which is usually around 29,100.
But why do we actually need this slowdown in listings, even if sales are reasonably healthy? It goes back to that overstock situation we've been tracking all year, right?
Correct. The market experienced this sort of unprecedented supply shock after the frenzy of 2021 and 2022. And we are still processing that glut.
Right.
Our established ready reckoner, the rough guide that there's about 10% more stock than you'd see in a normal balanced market that's still very much functional, it still holds true.
So even with fewer listings week on week?
Exactly. Despite this recent dip in weekly listings, the year-to-date figure is immense. We've seen 1.53 million homes listed so far this year. That's still 9.1% ahead of the 9-year average.
Wow.
We are still listing more properties than we are currently selling, which means the overall stock level just remains stubbornly elevated. The market can handle the sales volume, yes, but it can't handle the inventory volume without seeing prices adjust downwards.
And that pressure on inventory seems to be forcing a really significant shift in either the type of properties being listed or at least their initial asking prices.
This is a crucial data point, I think. The average price of the properties that were newly listed in week 43 was actually under £400,000.
Under £400, that sounds low.
It's the lowest average listing price we've recorded in 4 years. And you really see the difference if you compare that directly to the same week back in 2024, just 12 months ago, when the average listing price was £434,400.
Okay, so what does that £400 K threshold really tell us? Is it genuinely cheaper properties suddenly flooding the market? Or is it more likely that the owners of those 430K properties are finally listing them at, say, 395K because they realize the original price point just isn't achievable anymore?
It's probably a bit of both, but I suspect the latter is the more significant signal here. It suggests that sellers, or maybe more accurately their estate agents, are becoming drastically more realistic with their initial pricing.
Because they have to be.
They know that in an oversupplied market like this, aggressive, realistic pricing is absolutely essential just to generate viewings, let alone offers and sales. This increased realism is necessary because otherwise they just end up in that second phase of distress, having to make price reductions later on.
Which brings us neatly to reduction activity, probably the most crucial insight for actual buyers out there. The rate of price reductions remains extremely high, doesn't it?
It really does. While the actual volume of reductions dropped slightly in week 43 to about 18,300 again, partly due to that seasonal slowdown, the context for 2025 as a whole is stark.
How stark?
The average reduction rate for the entire year so far is 13.2%. Now compare that to the 5-year average, which is 10.7%. So the rate this year is 23% higher.
23% higher.
Yeah. So our other key ready reckoner holds true here too. We currently have about 25% more properties with price reductions than you typically find in a normal market right now.
That's a massive quantifiable advantage for buyers, isn't it? It signals real urgency among some sellers. But despite all this pressure, the market is still transacting healthy volumes, correct? People are still buying and selling.
Absolutely. Sales subject to contract, or SSTCs as we call them, they were robust at 23,500 in that week. That's very close to the 9-year average of 23,800.
And compared to last year?
It's actually up 4.2% year on year, which signifies a much stronger intention to transact compared to 12 months ago when things were really quite frozen.
Yeah.
For gross sales overall, 2025 is actually shaping up pretty well. It's the second best year we've seen in the last 9 years, only trailing that sort of crazy pandemic boom year of 2021.
So the market is functional. The transaction gears are definitely turning.
They are.
But the tension is immense then. Functional transaction volume versus this almost suffocating level of inventory. Remind us of that total inventory figure again.
Yeah, we hit an 8-year high as we entered October. There were 751,797 homes officially on the market.
Wow. And how does that compare to normal?
Well, contrast that with what we'd consider healthy, maybe a bit sticky, pre-pandemic market that was around 660,000 properties. And a proper seller's market was typically sub 600,000. So sitting over 750,000. We are deep, deep in buyer territory. The sales are happening, yes, but the sheer volume of new listings just relentlessly outpaces them, preventing that inventory level from falling back to anything near balanced.
Okay, let's talk about the metric that actually predicts future prices, rather than just tracking today's often inflated asking prices. That's pricing per square foot on sales agreed, right?
Yes. This is the critical insight, I think, because it cuts through all the noise you get from the Halifax and nationwide indices, which are based on mortgage approvals or asking prices. The pricing per square foot, the Solok tack on SSTCs, has a really strong, about 92% correlation with the official land registry data, which is the measure we see reported months later capturing completed sales.
And why is that correlation so strong? What makes it predictive?
Because the land registry tracks actual completion prices. The SSTC metric captures the price that was agreed before the transaction completes, usually several months before. So it captures the committed price point, filtering out all the noise of initial listings and subsequent reductions.
Okay, so what did October show?
October sales agreed averaged 338.38 per square foot. Now, crucially, this actually arrested a worrying 3-month decline we'd seen previously. There was a 2.9% drop in that metric between June and September, so October saw a bit of stabilization, which is positive.
Right. But if the land registry data lags by, say, 5 to 6 months, that summer slide in SSTC pricing that 2.9% drop is what we should be preparing to see in the official figures maybe in Q1 of 2026.
Precisely. That downward pressure we saw building over the summer implies we're probably heading for a relatively tough Q1 2026 for the official land registry reported prices. If that 2.9% drop we saw over the summer sustains through the lagging indicators, well, we could easily see official prices reporting down maybe 1.5% to 2% for 2025 overall.
Even if the annual indices like Halifax are currently showing a small increase.
Exactly. The real-time data, the stuff happening at the coalface of agreed sales, always tells the harsher story first. It leads the official indices.
And finally, just quickly, let's confirm the stability of the transaction process itself. Are deals falling apart more often?
No, interestingly, fall-throughs remain remarkably stable, pretty much smack on the long-term average of 24.2%. The fact that net sales, the ones that actually stick and complete, are running ahead of both the 9-year average and 2022 levels confirms again that this is not a dysfunctional market. It's simply a highly price-sensitive and stock-saturated market. Buyers are transacting, but really only when they feel they've extracted a realistic price from the seller.
Okay, moving on to the broader UK economy now. Section 3 gives us, well, a genuinely mixed bag of macroeconomic indicators, doesn't it? Starting with the PMI's Purchasing Managers Indexes, which are usually our best real-time economic heartbeat readings.
Yeah. PMIs always require careful interpretation. Manufacturing printed 49.7. Now, technically, that's still fractionally below the 50 mark, which separates expansion from contraction. But we did see output up for the first time in a whole year.
Which sounds like recovery.
It sounds like it, but you have to dig into why. The source material attributes that growth primarily to businesses basically eating into their existing order backlogs. They aren't reporting a big surge in new demand, either from home or from overseas customers. So this little bounce might actually be quite short-lived if we don't see sustained new orders materializing pretty quickly. It's not necessarily a sign of underlying strength yet.
Right, and contrast that slight, maybe fragile manufacturing positivity with the construction sector that printed a horror headline number.
A truly concerning number, yeah. Construction printed just 44.1. That's declining at the fastest pace in over 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's the 10th consecutive month it's been below that crucial 50 expansion threshold.
And where were the weakest parts?
The steepest reductions are in civil engineering big infrastructure projects, that was down at 35.4, and also residential house building, which came in at 43.6, both deep in contraction territory.
Why is such a severe collapse in construction activity right now?
It seems to be the direct result of risk aversion and decision delay. It's fueled by two main factors, really. Firstly, high borrowing costs, which make financing big projects punitive.
Makes sense.
And secondly, heightened political and economic uncertainty, specifically surrounding the upcoming budget and future interest rate moves. Tim Moore from S&P, who compiles the data, noted that weak sales pipelines and just fragile investment sentiment are creating an environment where developers simply stop committing to new large-scale projects. They're hitting pause.
Is there any glimmer of hope in that construction data?
The only slight positive is that input cost inflation, the price of materials and so on, did moderate to a 12-month low. So if activity ever resumes, that might eventually help margins. But right now, the activity just isn't there.
But services, thankfully, the largest chunk of the UK economy, provided the necessary lift, didn't it?
Services and the overall composite index were the saviors this time around, yeah. They printed 52.3 and 52.2 respectively, both comfortably above 50. Business activity saw a solid upturn, new order growth is actually accelerating, and employment is getting near stabilization.
So that's positive.
Yeah, this growth in the services sector is broadly congruent with about 0.2% quarterly growth coming from the private sector alone, which is pretty essential right now to offset the sheer depth of that construction slump.
And what was the most important piece of news for the Bank of England kind of buried within that services data?
Yes. Input price inflation hit an 11-month low within the service sector.
Okay.
That's music to the Monetary Policy Committee's ears. It suggests that those underlying cost pressures might finally be easing in the largest, most inflation-sensitive part of the economy.
Which gives them breathing room.
Exactly. It gives them space to justify pausing the rate hike cycle, which is what they did. However, we have to temper that optimism slightly with the reality of wage expectations.
Right. The market consensus seems pretty optimistic about wages falling back, but the structural factors, like the minimum wage increase, suggest they might be wrong.
Yeah, the current market consensus, which seems to be predicting wage rises falling quite quickly down to maybe 3.75% to 4%. That looks far too optimistic based on the structural inputs we know are coming.
So what's more plausible?
A forecast of maybe 4.5% to 5% plus Kaya, that feels far more plausible. And this is driven heavily by the impending, legally mandated increase in the national living wage, or the minimum wage.
Do we know how much that will be?
Well, the Low Pay Commission makes recommendations, but the mid-range forecast puts it somewhere around £12.71 per hour. History suggests the government might push it even higher than that for political reasons.
And businesses know this is coming.
Oh, yes. Businesses are already factoring this compulsory increase into their, frankly, quite bearish outlooks. It maintains that upward pressure on the overall wage bill, making it harder for overall wage inflation to fall rapidly.
Okay, now on to the Halifax House Price Index. This completely blindsided the consensus forecast, didn't it?
It really was a genuine surprise. The market consensus was expecting maybe a meager 0.1% growth for October, possibly even flat. But the actual figure came in at a 0.6% monthly rise.
0.6%. That's quite strong.
It is. Annually, this pushes the increase up to plus 1.9%, which interestingly does sit within that broader 1.5% to 2% annual expectation range we've discussed before based on other metrics.
And we're on the verge of a big headline milestone, aren't we?
We are literally within a hair's breadth. The Halifax average price reached $299,862 first, crossing that 300,000-pound threshold. Well, it'll be a major psychological moment, is guaranteed to generate national headlines, regardless of the underlying market health issues we just discussed from the real-time data.
It's a big number. Regionally, where is the growth holding up best, according to Halifax?
Northern Ireland continues to press on very strongly, remarkably, at plus 8% year-on-year. Scotland is also leading the charge among the mainland nations at plus 4.4%.
And
Predictably, London and the southeast saw slight falls. It reinforces that north-south divide in property performance we're seeing right now. Probably due to affordability pressures and higher debt servicing costs, disproportionately hitting those already high-value markets much harder.
Okay. We also have some crucial data points from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, which seem to be fueling future policy risk, specifically around vehicle emissions and potential transport taxes.
Yes, the penetration rate of electric vehicles is now getting so high, it's almost forcing the government's hand on taxation policy.
How high are we talking?
Electric vehicles, and this includes pure battery electrics, BEVs, plug-in hybrids, PHEVs, and standard hybrids collectively hit 54% of all new car registrations back in September. That's a significant jump from 44% just 1 year prior. Pure battery electrics alone accounted for 23% of new registrations.
So at that scale, the current incentives and tax breaks become financially unsustainable for the Treasury rate.
Exactly. The speed of this shift means the government is rapidly losing billions and billions in fuel duty revenue. And at this level of penetration, over half of new cars having some form of electrification, the rumors and speculation about withdrawing incentives or introducing new charges, well, they essentially become policy imperatives.
What sort of things might we expect?
We anticipate seeing measures like perhaps a 3p per mile road usage tax for EVs, or at the very least ensuring that EVs become fully subject to things like congestion charges relatively soon. The scale of adoption has now basically rendered the existing tax framework obsolete for transport. Change has to come.
Finally, before we get to the Bank of England decision itself, let's look quickly at the bond markets, gilts, and swaps. What did the movement in yields tell us last week? Did the yield curve steepen or flatten?
The gilt market saw a sort of small casual drift upwards last week. Nothing too dramatic. The 5-year yield, for example, opened the week at 3.888% and closed a bit higher at 3.933%. But the critical detail is that the 30-year yield, the very long-term borrowing cost, rose more significantly. It went from 5.181% at the open to 5.252% at the close.
So the long end rose more than the short end.
Exactly. And that differential caused the yield curve to steepen.
Now, for listeners who aren't bond market gurus, why is a steepening yield curve important? What does it typically tell us about long-term risk perceptions?
It's a really key signal of how investors view long-term risk. When the yield curve steepens, it means that long-term investors, the ones buying those 30-year bonds, are demanding significantly higher compensation, a higher interest rate, for holding government debt compared to short-term investors.
And why would they demand that higher compensation?
It typically suggests one of two things, or maybe a combination. First, investors might expect higher inflation way out in the future. Or second, and perhaps more relevant right now, they might demand a higher risk premium because they're less confident about the government's long-term financial stability or fiscal discipline.
So, in the UK context, given the mounting debt and the scale of the upcoming fiscal hole we're about to discuss, it's probably weighted towards the latter. Concerns about long-term fiscal health.
I think it's heavily weighted toward the latter right now, yes. Investors seem less confident about the government's ability or maybe willingness to maintain fiscal discipline many years down the road.
Interesting. So, a less steep curve might imply confidence in near-term Bank of England action to control inflation, but a steeper curve shows nervousness about the Treasury's long-term choices.
That's a good way to think about it. The 5-year range of 3.75% to 4.25% still seems to be holding as a fair trading range, which suggests stability is expected in the near term. But those overnight swap curves, which are market predictions of future interest rates, they're still pricing the bank rate down at 3.43% in 12 months' time.
Which is lower than the bank itself seems to be signaling.
Much lower than the current narrative of central bank caution would suggest. So that gap shows a definite disagreement, or maybe just a difference in expectation between the bond markets and the forward guidance coming from the Bank of England itself.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to the central policy dilemma. The Bank of England's decision to hold interest rates last week, it was a major pattern interrupt, wasn't it? Signaling perhaps the end of that recent cycle of rate cuts we'd seen.
It absolutely was. For the last 5 Monetary Policy Committee meetings that were accompanied by a revised economic forecast, we had seen a rate cut, usually 0.25%. This time, they held the bank rate steady at 4%, but crucially, the vote was 5-4.
5-4, that is razor thin. What does that tell us?
It tells us there was severe internal disagreement on the committee. A 5-4 split is about as close as it gets.
That tight margin is huge politically and for market interpretation. Who are the dissenters, broadly speaking, and what does the market take away from that level of internal disagreement?
Well, the split suggests you have 4 members who are still highly concerned about potentially entrenched inflation, maybe structural wage pressures keeping things high, while the majority of 5 clearly believe the current inflation data allowed for a pause, or perhaps they even felt a cut might be warranted very soon.
And how does the market read that 5-4?
The market views that 5-4 split as a sign of extreme caution from the bank, but also as an indication that the decision is very finely balanced. It means that any further positive data on inflation, especially, say, another drop in that service sector input price inflation we mentioned, could easily flip just one of those voters.
Triggering a cut at the next meeting.
Potentially, yes. It signals to the government, look, we're holding some for now, but we are watching every single data point like hawks. The bank is operating under maximum scrutiny, and the pressure is immense.
Now, to really understand the implications of the current 4% rate, we probably need to revisit the concept of the natural rate of interest, sometimes called R star. Could you explain that concept again, maybe in a bit more depth?
Sure. The natural rate, or R star, is a theoretical interest rate. It's the rate that would prevail if the economy were operating at full capacity and inflation were stable at the target, say 2%. Crucially, it's the rate that neither stimulates economic growth nor suppresses it.
The Goldilocks rate. Not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly, the Goldilocks rate. Now, estimating it is notoriously difficult, but most economists reckon it's somewhere between 3.5% and 4% for the UK right now.
Okay, so when the bank rate was up at 5.25% earlier, it was clearly above that natural rate.
Oh, significantly above, yes. And when the official bank rate is significantly above that estimated natural rate, it actively suppresses the economy. It makes borrowing more expensive, dampens investment, cools demand.
And where are we now at 4%?
At 4%, we're essentially right on the upper bound, maybe even slightly above the midpoint of that estimated natural rate range. So we're likely still in mildly restrictive territory. Now, if the current inflationary issues were purely down to structural factors like a genuine, massive global commodity shock, then maybe holding rates at this level, or even higher, would be necessary. But the argument is that since many of the UK's current inflationary pressures are arguably self-inflicted,
Like what, for example?
like a previous increase in employers' national insurance contributions, that acted essentially as a tax on employment, pushing up business costs. So the argument goes, maintaining rates at the high end of the natural rate range might be actively suppressing economic activity for reasons that aren't really related to genuine underlying demand pull inflation. It's keeping capital expensive when perhaps the economy doesn't need quite that level of suppression anymore.
Interesting point. What are the bank's own latest forecasts telling us about the future path for inflation and interest rates? Are they optimistic?
The MPC is relatively optimistic, yes. They stated they believe inflation has now peaked. They're projecting it falls to 3% early next year, and then, quite impressively, all the way back down to 2.1% basically target by the end of their forecast period in 2027.
That sounds good, but is it believable?
Well, skepticism is probably warranted. We see little concrete evidence, yet that core inflation, which is the really sticky measure that strips out volatile food and energy costs, is cooling quickly enough to support hitting that 3% target early next year, especially given the ongoing tightness we still see in the labor market and those wage pressures we discussed.
So the bank might be being a bit too hopeful on inflation.
Possibly. And the future rate path the bank is projecting is also highly contingent on market expectations, isn't it?
It is entirely contingent, yes. The bank's economic model essentially assumes the market is correct in its current pricing for future rate cuts.
And what is the market pricing in?
The market is pricing in potentially one cut coming maybe in December or February, and then perhaps one more cut next year, with the bank rate eventually bottoming out somewhere around 3.5% next year.
So the bank's forecast depends on those cuts happening? Yes. If those cuts don't happen, then their inflation forecast would likely be lower, and their growth forecast perhaps weaker. They are also remarkably bearish on the job market. They're forecasting unemployment to hit 5% by the end of this year.
5%? That's quite a jump.
It is. It's a clear sign they anticipate that the high rates we've already had will bite hard into job creation over the coming months. They don't seem to have much confidence in robust job creation.
Okay. This whole high-stakes environment brings us directly to the budget, doesn't it? The government faces this necessary, probably quite painful, reckoning. They need to plug a massive fiscal hole.
The need is urgent, yeah, and the hole is potentially vast. Estimates range anywhere between $20 billion and $50 billion.
Why such a big gap?
Primarily because official forecasts for economic growth and productivity have been revised downwards quite significantly. Less growth means less tax revenue, creating this gap. So the government is kind of cornered. They have to choose between delivering an inflationary budget or a disinflationary one.
Right. What exactly would an inflationary budget measure look like in this context, and why are we pretty confident they'll try to avoid it?
Well, the most dangerous potential inflationary threat that gets talked about sometimes would be a major VAT restructuring. Specifically, lowering the VAT registration threshold for small businesses quite drastically.
From what to what, potentially?
Well, currently it's around £90,000 turnover. If they were to slash that down to, say, £30,000, as some have suggested to broaden the tax base,
What would happen?
prevailing research suggests that move alone would be seriously inflationary. The estimates are it could add anywhere from 0.7% to 1% to the consumer price index almost immediately, as hundreds of thousands of small businesses would suddenly have to register for VAT and pass those new costs straight on to consumers.
And that would force the bank's hand.
It would almost guarantee the Bank of England would have to raise interest rates again to counteract it, which is precisely why we anticipate it being highly unlikely right now. It completely defeats the government's primary objective, which has to be demonstrating fiscal discipline to keep borrowing costs down.
Okay, so the politically difficult but perhaps macroeconomically sensible choice is to be actively disinflationary.
It is. And the most direct way to be disinflationary is by taxing income hitting people directly in their pockets.
How does that work?
It works by draining demand out of the economy. People have less disposable income, so they spend less. That makes macro sense because it helps control inflation, which should, in theory, help bring down future interest rates, which is the ultimate prize.
But there's a painful trade-off.
A very painful trade-off. Depressing consumption is pretty toxic for economic growth, especially since consumer spending is the single largest driver of the UK economy. So you lower growth, which in turn lowers tax revenue, and suddenly that deficit hole starts to reappear. It's a vicious circle.
So, since neither major path big inflationary measures or big deflationary tax hikes looks easy or politically palatable, the likely scenario is probably a series of clever policy tweaks, designed to mitigate the political pain while still achieving broadly disinflationary ends.
That feels like the most probable route, yes.
Yeah.
And we can probably confidently predict two major pillars of this tweak approach. The first is the easy win, fiscal drag.
Explain fiscal drag again.
This simply means extending the freeze on income tax thresholds, probably all the way out until 2030 now. This painlessly for the government, not the taxpayer, raises about $10 billion a year
How?
because inflation does the work for the Treasury. As wages rise with inflation, more people are pushed into higher tax brackets or start paying tax for the first time, even though the actual tax rates haven't changed. It's a stealth tax.
Okay, so that's one pillar. What's the second, more complex tweak that's being heavily rumored? The exchange between national insurance and income tax.
Yes, this is the potential political masterpiece, if they pull it off. The rumor suggests a 2 pence increase on the basic rate of income tax, but matched simultaneously by a 2 pence cut on employee national insurance contributions.
So income tax up 2p, NI down 2p. What's the net effect?
It actually raises about $6 billion overall for the Treasury because income tax has a broader base. But politically, it allows the government to claim they are cutting taxes, focusing on the NI cut, while simultaneously increasing their overall revenue. It's clever politics.
And this NI income tax switch is often framed partly as a fairness argument too, isn't it? Moving the tax burden away from just earned income. How does that mechanism work for the listener? Why is it seen as fairer by some?
Well, it addresses what some see as a glaring inequity in the current system. Employee national insurance is only paid on income from working salaries, bonuses, etc. Income tax, however, is paid on most sources of income, work income, yes, but also pension income, rental income, savings interest above allowances. So if you were to scrap employee NI entirely, or even just reduce it significantly and move that financial burden onto income tax instead, you could argue it improves fairness. How? By ensuring that those people who have large non-working incomes think perhaps some landlords receiving significant net rental income, or maybe some pensioners receiving very large final salary pensions contribute proportionally as much to the public pot as someone earning the exact same amount through a salary. It makes the tax base fairer and broader potentially without necessarily increasing the headline tax burden on the majority of standard salaried workers.
It's a classic example of using these tweaks to achieve quite a significant structural change without actually announcing a big, scary structural reform program.
Precisely. It's politically astute, if complex.
We also hear whispers, as always before a budget, about other sources of revenue being tweaked around the edges, savings, maybe death duties.
Yes, tweaks to inheritance tax, IHT, are perennially on the table. Things like lowering the threshold at which it kicks in, or perhaps extending the potentially exempt transfer period, the time you have to live after gifting money for it to be outside your estate, maybe from 7 years to 10 years, to capture more assets.
And pensions and savings?
Addressing pension tax relief is another one. Perhaps moving to a flat rate of relief, say 25% or 28% for all taxpayers, rather than the current system which gives higher rate taxpayers relief at 40% or 45%. Disproportionately benefiting higher earners. And there's also sometimes talk of lowering the annual ISA allowance from its current £20,000.
Why target ISAs?
Well, critics argue that ISAs, particularly at that high allowance level, have become simply an unnecessarily generous tax avoidance measure, primarily benefiting high savers who are probably least likely to rely on the state pension system anyway. So reducing the allowance could be seen as progressive.
Ultimately, though, all these potential moves, the fiscal drag, the non-income tax swap, the IHT tweaks, they're all designed primarily to manage the interest rate outcome in the medium term, aren't they? Even if they depress demand today.
That's the core goal. Control inflation, demonstrate fiscal responsibility, keep the bond markets happy, keep interest rates and debt servicing costs as low as possible.
But they arguably avoid addressing a really massive structural problem that high inflation itself has exacerbated. Which brings us, I think, to the Munger insight you mentioned.
Yes, this is really the crux, I believe, of the UK's ongoing productivity puzzle and the weirdness we see in labor market participation figures compared to other countries. It's captured perfectly by that Charlie Munger rule. Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome.
And the argument is that the incentive structure in the UK labor market is now fundamentally broken, particularly at the lower end, specifically because of the interaction between high inflation, frozen tax thresholds, and the benefit system.
Exactly. The maths has become really quite distorted.
Okay, let's break down these maths gymnastics, maybe step by step for the listener. How does this welfare work incentive imbalance actually play out?
Okay, step one. Benefits, like universal credit, are generally inflation-linked. They're set to go up by 3.8% next year, linked to the retail price index. So claimants are getting, broadly speaking, a real terms increase in their support to keep pace with rising costs.
Okay, step one, benefits keep pace. Step two.
Step two, income tax thresholds are frozen solid. That means every single extra pound someone earns through wage increases is immediately subject to tax, thanks to fiscal drag pushing them up the bands or into tax altogether.
Right. And step three.
Step three, benefits received are generally not taxed, whereas a full-time person working on the minimum wage after paying their income tax and national insurance currently pays about 14% of their gross income straight back to the government in tax.
Okay, so just to summarize, high inflation pushes up benefits untaxed, while frozen tax thresholds mean any pay rises for low earners get heavily taxed immediately via fiscal drag.
Precisely. You've effectively created a punitive tax on low-paid work, while simultaneously boosting the relative value of untaxed benefit income.
And the consequence of this is?
The consequence is pretty stark. The source material we looked at concludes that, on average, looking at disposable income after tax, benefits claimants are now potentially around 25% better off compared to a working person on the national living wage.
25% better off not working, on average.
That's the conclusion from the analysis, yes. The system, through this interaction of inflation, frozen thresholds, and benefit uprating, has inadvertently created a quantifiable, massive disincentive for some people, particularly those with potential barriers to work like childcare costs or health issues, to engage in the formal labor force at the lower end of the pay scale.
And this structural imbalance, this disincentive, could explain why the UK's labor market figures things like participation rates, sickness levels look so out of kilter compared to many other Western economies right now.
Absolutely. It helps explain why we might be seeing higher rates of people claiming sickness benefits, higher economic inactivity, and critically, those lower labor force participation rates, especially among certain groups. Why, logically, would you take on a physically demanding, potentially stressful job for only marginally more net income, maybe even less, once you factor in travel and childcare costs than you might receive through the benefit system?
So, until that fundamental welfare work incentive imbalance is addressed through genuine structural reform, not just tinkering with tax rates, the UK economy is effectively operating with one hand tied behind its back, and productivity will inevitably struggle to recover.
That's the strong argument being made, yes. These budget tweaks might manage the immediate fiscal pressures, but they don't fix this underlying incentive problem, which could be holding back the UK's long-term growth potential. Hashtag DFAVG.
Well, this has been a monumental synthesis today. We've tracked global instability and that, frankly, terrifying debt growth in the U.S. We've watched a UK property market clearly defined by buyer power and necessary price reductions despite decent sales volumes. And we've examined a Bank of England decision that was incredibly close, forcing a really difficult reckoning in the upcoming UK budget.
Yeah, the overarching theme that comes through, I think, is this constant tension between policy management and genuine structural reform. Every policy tweak we've discussed today, that potential NI income tax switch, the extended threshold freezes. They feel like politically designed moves primarily to manage the interest rate outcome.
Right.
The government seems laser-focused on delivering disinflationary measures, whatever it takes, to control those crucial debt servicing costs, even if those choices inevitably suppress demand and slow down economic growth in the short term.
And that cost paid by consumers through suppressed demand, paid through fiscal drag, is seen as essential to give the bond markets confidence, to reduce the cost of government borrowing. But it absolutely comes at a price to the consumer today and potentially to the long-term structural health of the economy if deeper issues aren't addressed.
Indeed. Now, interestingly, the source material we drew on does offer a prediction, maybe even a hopeful one. It suggests a potential surefire bull run for the UK economy towards 2030, once this current period of sort of stock suppression in the property market and slow economic growth finally ends, and perhaps interest rates stabilize at a lower level.
A bull run towards 2030. Okay, but this leads us, I think, to our final provocative thought for you, our listener, to carry forward and mull over.
Given this current, almost complete reliance on policy tweaks and clever political maneuvering, rather than attempting deep, potentially unpopular structural reforms, especially concerning that fundamental welfare work incentive imbalance that seems to be actively penalizing labor market participation.
Is the UK economy truly building the underlying confidence, the resilience, the capability for a genuinely sustainable, strong bull run towards 2030? Or are we perhaps just utilizing political ingenuity and fiscal drag to merely postpone the full burden of necessary but much more painful structural changes that are ultimately needed for long-term prosperity?
It's the critical question, isn't it? What happens when the tweaks run out of road? Something to definitely mull over as you process all this data we've thrown at you today.
Indeed. That's it for this week's deep dive. We'll be back soon to keep cutting through the complexity.